On the morning of January 14, 1995, a couple in Beaumont, Texas, drove to their daughter's townhouse on Park Meadow Drive. She hadn't answered her phone since the night before. The front door was unlocked when they arrived. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere in the home. They found her upstairs, in the bathroom. She was handcuffed behind her back with police-grade Smith & Wesson restraints. Her head was slumped over the edge of the bathtub, which had been filled with water. She had been sexually assaulted. Her body bore more than 30 separate injuries. She was 31 years old. Her mother picked up the phone and dialed 911. Through the line, the dispatcher heard 5 words no parent should ever have to speak. "My daughter has been murdered." And for the next 26 years, nobody would be held accountable for what happened inside that townhouse. Not a single arrest, not one charge, just silence, dead ends, and a community left haunted by a question that only grew louder with time. Who killed Mary Catherine Edwards? If this is your first time here at Watch Crime Cold File, you're about to go deep into one of the most chilling cold cases in Texas history. Hit that subscribe button and drop a like on this video so you don't miss what comes next. This one demands your attention from beginning to end. To understand what was taken that night, you need to understand who Catherine was when she was alive. Because the people of Beaumont didn't just lose a neighbor. They lost someone who shaped the way an entire generation of children saw themselves. Mary Catherine Edwards was a 5th-grade teacher at Price Elementary School in Beaumont. She had grown up in the area, attended Forest Park High School, and gone on to college, where she joined a sorority. After graduating, she came right back to the community that raised her and started building a career in the classroom. She never left. Some people chase opportunity in distant cities. Catherine planted herself in the soil she already knew and poured everything she had into the children of Beaumont. Her principal, Floyd Broussard, described her as a devoted educator who regularly stayed late after the final bell, preparing lesson plans for the following day while the hallways emptied around her. She wasn't merely going through the motions. Teaching wasn't her job. It was the center of her life. The people closest to Catherine described her as warm, trusting, and generous. One of her former students recalled a homeroom party where the parents had forgotten to send enough money for snacks. Catherine drove to the store and bought everything the kids needed out of her own pocket. Another former student, a boy who had been painfully shy in her class, said years later that she was the teacher who allowed him to be exactly who he was, without pressure to change, and that her patience helped him come out of his shell. These weren't grand gestures. They were the small, steady acts of a woman who cared about the people around her in a way that left marks long after they left her classroom. Catherine lived alone with her beagle, a dog named Maggie, in a modest townhouse on the west end of Beaumont. She kept a quiet routine, walked the dog each evening, prepared her lessons, spent weekends with her family, who lived nearby. Her life was built around simple patterns, the kind of rhythms that make a person feel safe. But there was one detail about Catherine that everyone in the community knew, and it mattered more than most people realized at the time. She had an identical twin sister named Allison, who also worked as an elementary school teacher in the Beaumont district. The resemblance between them was so uncanny that Catherine developed a habit at the start of each new school year. She would stand in front of her class and tell the children that if they saw someone who looked exactly like her walking around the building, and that person didn't wave or say hello, they shouldn't get their feelings hurt. It was probably just her sister. It was a light-hearted moment. The kind of detail that made Catherine's students laugh on the first day of school. A small, warm joke to ease the confusion. But it also revealed something about the bond between them. They moved through the same spaces, shared the same face, lived within a short drive of each other. They weren't just siblings, they were mirrors. Allison was the last member of the family to see Catherine alive. On the afternoon of Friday, January 13th, 1995, Catherine stopped by Allison's home after work to pick up Maggie, who Allison had been dog-sitting. She stayed for a few minutes, played with Allison's infant daughter, and chatted. Allison would later recall that her sister seemed a little sad that day. Catherine left and drove home. Reports indicate she walked Maggie, poured herself a glass of wine, and called her boyfriend. That phone call was the last confirmed contact anyone had with her. By Saturday morning, Catherine's parents had grown concerned. She wasn't answering the phone. The couple drove to her townhouse and let themselves in through the unlocked front door. What they found changed everything. The first officer to arrive at the scene was a woman named Carmen Brown Apple, a Beaumont police officer who recognized Catherine's name the moment dispatch sent the call. They had been in the same sorority in college. Apple would later say that Catherine was so full of life and that arriving at the scene and realizing the victim was someone she knew personally hit her like a wall. It took her a moment to absorb what she was looking at. Inside the townhouse, investigators began processing a crime scene that raised more questions than it answered. Catherine had been sexually assaulted. The medical examiner would ultimately determine her cause of death to be a combination of drowning and compression asphyxiation. Her attacker had pinned her down with such force that the weight compressed her chest until she could no longer draw breath. Based on the physical evidence, that process would have taken somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes. It was not quick. DNA was recovered from the sexual assault that same day. Detectives noted the professional-grade handcuffs binding the victim's wrists. The serial numbers were traced, but they led nowhere. The restraints were standard-issue Smith & Wesson models widely available on the commercial market, the same type carried by law enforcement officers across the country. And that observation introduced a deeply uncomfortable possibility into the investigation. Catherine had let her attacker inside. The locks weren't broken. The windows were intact. Nothing suggested a forced entry of any kind. She appeared to have opened the door willingly, which meant she likely recognized the person standing on the other side of it. Combine that with police-grade handcuffs and a crime scene that showed methodical control rather than impulsive violence, and investigators began asking themselves a question nobody wanted to speak out loud. Was the killer a police officer? Officers were questioned. DNA samples were collected from every plausible suspect within Catherine's orbit. The ex-boyfriend, neighbors, colleagues, acquaintances from church, members of her social circle. Every single sample came back negative. The DNA recovered from the crime scene belonged to one unknown male, and he didn't match anyone investigators could find. One veteran detective who worked the case would later describe the atmosphere surrounding the investigation as almost like a ghost story told around a campfire. That's what it felt like to the people working it. A brutal, methodical killing committed by a suspect who appeared to exist nowhere in any system. A phantom with a badge, or at least someone who wanted to look like he carried one. The unspoken fear lingered in the department like smoke. It hung over briefings and shift changes and quiet conversations in hallways. Nobody wanted to be the one to say it plainly, but everybody was thinking the same thing. What if the person who did this wears the same uniform we do? The crime scene DNA was entered into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, a national database containing genetic profiles of convicted offenders. Detectives ran the unknown male's profile and waited for the system to do what it was designed to do, to cross-reference that sample against every convicted offender on file and return a name. The search returned nothing. 0 hits. No match anywhere in the entire national database. And here is where the story runs into a wall that would hold for more than 2 decades. In 1995, DNA forensic technology was still in its relative infancy. The testing methods available at the time could only read approximately 20 genetic markers from the evidence samples collected at the scene. Some items, including a Laura Ashley comforter from Catherine's bed, the shirt she had been wearing, bed sheets, and fingernail clippings, couldn't produce usable results at all because the samples were too degraded or too small for the technology to process. What little the lab could extract pointed to a single male contributor. But without a match in CODIS, that profile was a locked door with no key. And CODIS itself had a critical limitation that most people outside of forensic science didn't fully appreciate at the time. The database only contained DNA from individuals who had already been convicted and processed into the system. Mandatory DNA collection from offenders didn't become standard in most states until the mid to late 1990s. That meant if Catherine's killer had committed crimes before that window, his genetic profile might never have been entered. He could have a criminal record, even a violent one, and the system would have no way of flagging him. He could be walking free, living his life, entirely invisible to the one tool that should have caught him. Every traditional investigative path had been exhausted. The DNA was a dead end. The handcuffs were untraceable in any meaningful way. The suspect pool had been tested and eliminated, person by person, name by name, until there was no one left to test. The case file thickened with reports, elimination results, and dead-end summaries, but none of it produced answers. Detectives had done everything the science and the system would allow them to do, and it wasn't enough. The investigation stalled and eventually went cold. But the people who loved Catherine the most refused to accept that silence as the final word. Year after year, they picked up the phone and called the Beaumont Police Department. They asked for updates. They asked whether anything new had come in, and the answer, every time, was the same. No news, no leads, nothing to report. And still, they called again. The following month, the following year, the year after that. This wasn't naivety. It was a deliberate, sustained act of refusal. They would not allow their daughter to become a forgotten file in a cabinet somewhere. The broader Beaumont community carried the weight of Catherine's memory in its own quiet way. Her former students, children who had been 10 years old in her classroom when she was killed, grew into adults who still thought about her. They remembered her smile. They remembered the way she treated them. One said that hearing what had been done to her was horrible because she had been such a genuinely kind person, the kind of teacher who made you feel seen. Another described the lingering sadness of knowing that no one had ever been held responsible. These weren't people who followed the case obsessively. They were ordinary men and women who had simply never been able to shake the memory of a teacher who mattered to them at a formative age and who had been taken in the worst possible way. Catherine Edwards wasn't a statistic on a crime board. She was someone an entire community remembered by name, years and even decades after she was gone. Inside the department, the case file was passed from one detective to another. Each one inherited the same evidence and the same dead ends. But they also inherited the discipline of their predecessors. The DNA was preserved, the physical evidence was maintained, and every time CODIS expanded, every time a new state added mandatory DNA collection for certain categories of offenders, someone ran the Edwards profile through the system again. It never returned a hit. In 2010, 15 years after Catherine's murder, Beaumont police detective Aaron Llewellyn began reviewing the department's unsolved cases from the ground up. He was methodical about it. He pulled the Edwards file and went through everything with fresh eyes. Crime scene photographs, video footage from the original processing of the townhouse, investigative reports spanning more than a decade of work by multiple detectives. He revisited every suspect that earlier investigators had already excluded, double-checking the elimination logic, making sure nothing had been overlooked. He built a formal cold case priority list, and the Edwards murder occupied a prominent place on it. But Llewellyn also recognized a fundamental constraint that no amount of rereading old files could overcome. The conventional forensic tools available to law enforcement had already been deployed to their full capacity on this case. CODIS was only as powerful as the profiles it contained. If the killer's DNA had never been collected and entered into the system, the database could run 1 billion comparisons and still return nothing. The evidence strongly suggested that was exactly the situation. Somewhere out there, a man whose DNA matched the crime scene profile was living undetected, untouched, and entirely beyond the reach of the one system built to find him. The case didn't need more detective work. It needed a scientific breakthrough that hadn't been invented yet. It would take another full decade for that breakthrough to arrive. In 2020, 25 years after Catherine's murder, the Texas Rangers Unsolved Crimes Investigation Program joined forces with the Beaumont Police Department to relaunch the investigation. Jefferson County District Attorney Bob Wortham had made the Edwards case a personal priority from the very first day he took office. He contacted the Beaumont police chief and directed him to assign his best people to it. The department offered a $6,000 reward for any information leading to an arrest. Texas Ranger Brandon Bess took the lead and began exploring a relatively new investigative method that had started producing extraordinary results in cold cases across the country. It was called forensic genetic genealogy. The concept is deceptively simple. Even if the killer himself had never submitted a DNA sample to any database, a distant relative of his might have. Millions of everyday Americans had been sending saliva samples to commercial ancestry services for years. Some of those results were uploaded to public databases like GEDmatch, where users could compare their profiles and find biological connections. If investigators could extract a usable genetic profile from the crime scene evidence and upload it to one of those public databases, they wouldn't need the killer to be in the system. They would only need a relative, perhaps a second or third cousin, someone connected by blood but separated by generations. From that single thread, a genealogist could start building a family tree outward, branch by branch, name by name, until the tree narrowed to a person whose profile matched the crime scene DNA. It was a revolutionary approach, but it required one thing the investigators didn't yet have: a DNA profile strong enough to work with. That's where Othram came in. Othram is a private forensic DNA laboratory located in the Woodlands, Texas, just north of Houston. It was founded with a singular purpose: to succeed where traditional forensic labs had failed. The facility was built from the ground up to handle exactly the kind of degraded, contaminated, or low-quantity biological evidence that conventional laboratories couldn't process. Where older technology hit a ceiling, Othram's whole genome sequencing approach pushed through it. Their methods were capable of reading hundreds of thousands of genetic markers from a single sample, compared to the roughly 20 that mid-1990s testing could manage. The gap between those two numbers is the gap between a cold case and a solved one. The remaining evidence from Catherine's case was sent to Othram's lab. The crime scene DNA was a mixture of Catherine's own genetic material and that of the unknown male. Standard testing in the 90s had produced a limited profile. Othram's scientists separated the male DNA from Catherine's and extracted more than 500,000 genetic markers. It was an exponential leap. The degraded, quarter-century-old sample that had once been a dead end was now a weapon. The enhanced profile was uploaded to GEDmatch. Within the results, second cousins of the unknown male appeared. Detective Tina Llewellyn, Aaron Llewellyn's wife, and also a Beaumont police detective, began working alongside forensic genetic genealogist Shara LaPointe to build a family tree outward from those matches. Over the course of roughly 3 months, they contacted distant relatives one by one and asked each of them for a voluntary DNA sample. More than 30 people cooperated. One by one, genetic connections were confirmed on both the paternal and maternal sides of a single family. The sprawling tree, which LaPointe eventually expanded to encompass more than 7,000 individuals, began to contract. Branches were eliminated. Lineages were ruled out. The broad web of distant cousins and half-relations slowly collapsed inward toward a tighter and tighter cluster, until it narrowed to 2 brothers. Both had grown up in Beaumont. Both had attended Forest Park High School, the same school Catherine Edwards had graduated from. LaPointe was working the case late one evening when the names finally came through. She sent a message to Detective Tina Llewellyn with the information and went to bed. When she woke the next morning, her phone had blown up with notifications. Aaron and Tina Llewellyn began running both brothers through every criminal database available to them. The first brother came back completely clean. No arrests, no charges, not so much as a traffic violation. Aaron ran the second brother next. His name was Clayton Bernard Foreman. He had a prior conviction in Jefferson County. For sexual assault, the conviction was from 1981. Aaron Llewellyn would later say that the hair on the back of his neck stood up when he read the details of that old case file. The method described in the 1981 offense was nearly identical to what had been done to Catherine Edwards 14 years later. On a rainy night in July of 1981, a 19-year-old woman named Paula Ramsey left a nightclub located off Interstate 10 in Beaumont. It had been raining heavily, and when she tried to leave, her car became stuck in a ditch near the bar. She slipped trying to get it out. Soaked and stranded, she gave up on the car and started walking toward a nearby gas station to call her mother for a ride home. A man was sitting in a parked vehicle nearby with his window rolled down. She recognized him from Forest Park High School. He told her he was a police officer and offered to drive her home. She was wet, stuck, and alone. The offer from someone claiming to be law enforcement felt safe. She got in the car. It seemed like the safest option she had. He didn't take her home. He drove to an empty field, stopped the car, and his entire demeanor shifted. He told her to stop talking and to shut up. He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a knife. He bound her hands behind her back using a belt. And then he assaulted her, repeatedly, at knife point. When it was over, he drove her home. Paula Ramsey didn't tell anyone what had happened for about a week. She felt ashamed. She questioned whether anyone would believe her. She wondered, as so many survivors do, whether it was somehow her fault. She would later describe the weight of that silence, the way it pressed down on her until she told herself she could never speak about it. But eventually, despite every instinct telling her to stay silent, she did speak. She went to the Beaumont police and filed a formal report. Clayton Foreman was identified and charged. The system had an opportunity now. A clear chance to hold a violent predator accountable and prevent whatever might come next. And what happened in that courtroom is something that still echoes through the entire arc of this case. Decades later, he pleaded guilty. Not to rape, to aggravated assault, and his sentence was 3 years of probation. No prison time. Probation for binding a woman's hands behind her back and assaulting her at knife point while pretending to be a law enforcement officer. He was 21 years old at the time, employed as a Nabisco salesman. 3 years of probation. That was the price the system placed on what he did to Paula Ramsey in that field. And because mandatory DNA collection from convicted offenders didn't begin in most states until years later, Clayton Foreman's genetic profile was never entered into CODIS. His name sat in an old case file in Jefferson County, attached to a conviction that carried no real consequence, while the system designed to catch people like him looked right through him. 14 years after that night in the field, Mary Catherine Edwards was found handcuffed in her own bathroom, bound from behind, sexually assaulted, dead. The method was almost identical, and the man responsible had been in the system once before. The justice system had him in its hands in 1981. It knew what he was capable of, and it let him walk away with nothing more than a signature on a probation form. That decision, made in a courtroom more than 4 decades ago, would cost Catherine Edwards her life. When investigators in 2021 sat staring at Clayton Foreman's old case file, the weight of what they were reading began to settle. The bindings, the false claim of being a police officer, the control, the isolation of the victim, the sexual violence. Pattern after pattern after pattern, separated by 14 years but connected by a method that was unmistakable. They had a name now. After 26 years of silence, of dead-end database searches and unanswered phone calls from grieving parents, of a ghost story told around a campfire in squad rooms, there was finally a face attached to the DNA. And the hair on the back of Aaron Llewellyn's neck hadn't lied. But having a name and proving a capital murder in a court of law are 2 very different things. The investigation was far from over. What came next? The DNA confirmation, the confrontation, the arrest, and the long road to trial would take years of painstaking work and would reveal details about Clayton Foreman's life that made the case even more disturbing than anyone had imagined. The DNA pointed to him, the method connected him, and the justice system's own records confirmed that he had done something terrifyingly similar before to another woman in the same city and had walked away with barely a consequence. If this case has gripped you the way it gripped the people of Beaumont for nearly 3 decades, make sure you're subscribed to Watch Crime Cold File so you're here when the next chapter drops. Hit that like button, leave a comment, and share this with someone who needs to hear Catherine's story. She waited 26 years for justice. The least we can do is make sure she's never forgotten. When investigators in 2021 pulled Clayton Foreman's background, they didn't just find the 1981 conviction for the rape of Paula Ramsey. They found a pattern, and once you see it laid out, there's no way to unsee it. In 1981, Foreman encountered a 19-year-old woman stranded in the rain outside a nightclub off Interstate 10. He told her he was a police officer. He offered her a ride home. Instead, he drove her to a secluded field, bound her hands behind her back with a belt, and assaulted her at knife point. He received 3 years of probation, no prison time. Then, sometime around 1985 or 86, according to testimony presented at trial, another woman from the same high school alleged that Foreman came to her apartment and held her at gunpoint. She never filed formal charges. And in 1995, Catherine Edwards was found handcuffed behind her back inside her own bathroom, sexually assaulted and dead. No forced entry. Police-grade restraints on her wrists. 3 women, all connected to Forest Park High School in Beaumont. In each documented incident, the attacker used some form of binding or physical restraint. In each case, the woman was isolated, controlled, and stripped of her ability to resist or escape. And in the first and third incidents, the assailant either claimed to be law enforcement or used tools directly associated with police authority to establish dominance over his victim. A belt and a verbal lie in 81. Smith & Wesson handcuffs in 95. The method didn't simply repeat itself across the years. It refined. It hardened. It escalated from improvisation to preparation, from a lie spoken in a car to professional restraints carried to a victim's home. But the connection between Clayton Foreman and Catherine Edwards ran deeper than anyone initially realized. Catherine and her identical twin sister Allison hadn't just attended the same high school as Foreman. They had been bridesmaids in his wedding. In January of 1982, 1 year after the Ramsey assault, Clayton Foreman married his first wife, Diana Dalio Coe. Diana had also gone to Forest Park High School, and when she first moved to the area as a teenager, the twin sisters were the first people to reach out to her. They befriended her on her very first day. They became close. When Diana planned her wedding, Catherine and Allison were the obvious choice for bridesmaids. They stood next to the bride while she married a man who, just 12 months earlier, had bound a woman's hands behind her back and raped her. Catherine knew Foreman. She knew him through Diana. She had stood beside him at his own ceremony, smiled for photographs, next to a man whose conviction for sexual assault was barely a year old at the time the wedding took place. And that history, that familiarity, that residual trust from a shared social circle is almost certainly why she opened her front door on the night she was killed. There was no forced entry at the townhouse on Park Meadow Drive because there didn't need to be. Catherine recognized the face on the other side of the door, a face she had known since high school, a face from a wedding album. She had absolutely no reason to be afraid of a man she had known for more than a decade, a man who had been married to one of her closest friends. But Diana Coe would eventually learn that there had always been reasons to be afraid. She just hadn't been able to see them yet. Diana testified at trial in March of 2024, and her account painted a portrait of a man whose fascinations and habits only became legible in hindsight. She told the court that approximately 3 weeks before their wedding, she learned that the man she was about to marry was on probation for rape. She confronted him. He told her it was a big misunderstanding and that the charges had been dropped. The invitations had already been mailed. She was 19 years old and had been dating him for 3 years. She believed what he told her and went through with the marriage. During the years that followed, small details accumulated. He kept a billy club by the bed and said it was for protection. He ordered a pair of Smith & Wesson handcuffs and hung them over the rearview mirror of his car, casually, as if it were a decoration. Sometime around 1987, Diana discovered a briefcase in the trunk of his car. Inside it was a gun, a pair of handcuffs, and pornographic material. Clayton Foreman had never been a police officer. He was never employed in law enforcement in any capacity. He worked as a salesman and a store manager, but his fixation on the tools of that profession was persistent and visible to anyone who was close enough to notice. The marriage lasted 11 years. They had a son together. Diana and Clayton divorced in 1993, 2 years before Catherine Edwards was killed. And when Diana heard the news about Catherine's death, she picked up the phone and called her ex-husband. She was crying. She told him that someone had murdered Catherine. His response, according to Diana's trial testimony, was 2 words. "Oh, really?" Flat, toneless, no shock, no follow-up question, no expression of sorrow for a woman who had been a bridesmaid at their wedding. Diana remembered the moment clearly. She thought it was odd, but she couldn't yet see what it meant. After the divorce, Foreman eventually left Beaumont. By 2007, he had relocated to Reynoldsburg, Ohio, a suburb east of Columbus, where he was living with a new fiancée. He was working as an Uber driver and, at some point, as a bill collector. He had built a new, unremarkable life more than 1,000 miles from the city where Catherine Edwards had been killed. But Foreman didn't vanish from Beaumont entirely. In 2018, he returned for the Forest Park High School reunion. He wasn't just an attendee, he was the organizer. Former classmates said he coordinated the entire program. He arranged logistics and put together the memorial tributes to classmates who had passed away since graduation, assembling slides and leading the room through moments of remembrance for the dead. People described him as thoughtful and warm. They said nobody would have expected him to be charged with anything, certainly not murder. He was the man who showed up, who volunteered his time, who honored the memories of people who were gone. And one of the classmates whose memory he helped preserve was a woman whose murder he had committed 23 years earlier. By the time investigators identified Foreman as their primary suspect in 2021, he was 61 years old and still living in Reynoldsburg with his fiancée. Detective Aaron Llewellyn sent a lead to the FBI's field office in Cincinnati and requested assistance with surveillance. The Bureau coordinated with the Reynoldsburg Police Department to monitor Foreman's residence without his knowledge. On April 15, 2021, a local detective surveilled the house and conducted what's known as a trash pull. The procedure is straightforward and legal. You wait for the subject to bring their garbage to the curb for collection. Once the bags are placed on public property, they can be collected without a warrant. The detective waited for Foreman to carry his trash out, watched him go back inside, and then retrieved the bags. Back at a secure location, detectives sorted through the contents and selected items with the highest potential for recovering DNA. What they cataloged was entirely ordinary: a clump of hair, a plastic fork, a plastic spoon, 5 empty prescription medicine bottles, each printed with Clayton Foreman's name, a piece of used dental floss. The items were sealed, labeled, and shipped to the Department of Public Safety Crime Lab in Houston, where analysts would attempt to extract a usable genetic profile and compare it against the DNA recovered from Catherine Edwards' sexual assault kit in 1995. Everything now rested on what those mundane household objects could prove: dental floss and medicine bottles and a plastic fork, pulled from a trash can on a suburban street in Ohio, carrying the potential to close a murder case that had resisted every investigative tool thrown at it for a quarter of a century. 13 days passed. 13 days of waiting for a phone call that would either confirm what the family tree had pointed toward or send investigators back to the beginning. On April 28, 2021, the results came back. The DNA recovered from Foreman's household trash was a confirmed match to the DNA taken from Catherine Edwards' body 26 years earlier. The DPS Crime Lab supervisor who processed the comparison, Tanya Dean, would later testify at trial that the statistical likelihood of the match occurring, by coincidence, was 461 septillion to 1. That is a number with 26 zeros trailing behind it. To put it plainly, there is no reasonable interpretation of that figure other than certainty. The next morning, April 29th, Texas Ranger Brandon Bess and Detective Aaron Llewellyn boarded a flight to Ohio. They arrived in Reynoldsburg and contacted Foreman by phone. They asked if he'd be willing to come to the local police station to answer a few questions. He agreed. When he arrived, they told him he was not under arrest. They told him he was free to leave at any time. Bess went a step further and physically switched seats with Foreman so that the suspect was closer to the door, a deliberate gesture to reinforce that he was not being detained. Everything that followed was recorded. The conversation lasted 49 minutes. Foreman told the investigators that he vaguely remembered Catherine and Allison being bridesmaids in his 1982 wedding, but denied any meaningful connection to either sister beyond that single day. He said he had not maintained contact with Catherine afterward. He claimed he didn't even know she had been murdered. Bess and Llewellyn pressed him. They showed him a photograph from his own wedding, Catherine and Allison standing next to his bride, and Foreman confirmed it was his ceremony, but reiterated that he had no relationship with either woman. Methodically, the investigators backed him into a series of contradictions and dead ends. Near the close of the interview, Ranger Bess looked at Foreman directly and told him what the lab had confirmed. His DNA had been found on Catherine Edwards' bed, and his DNA had been found inside Catherine Edwards' body. There was a pause. Foreman said he didn't know how that was possible, but acknowledged that they were telling him it was there. Bess told him that there was only one way for it to get there. He said there were two people who knew what happened inside that townhouse that night, and one of them was dead. Foreman ended the interview. He said he wanted to speak with an attorney. Bess and Llewellyn complied. They let him stand up. They let him walk out of the interrogation room and into the hallway. Approximately 30 seconds later, officers stopped him and placed him under arrest for capital murder. And here is where the story delivers its most powerful moment. The handcuffs they placed on Clayton Foreman's wrists were not standard-issue department restraints pulled from a patrol car. They were the same pair of Smith & Wesson handcuffs that had been removed from Mary Catherine Edwards's body on January 14, 1995. Bess and Llewellyn had worked with prosecutors ahead of time to have the evidence released from storage specifically for this purpose. They had carried those handcuffs from Texas to Ohio with a single intention in mind. Ranger Bess would later describe the moment publicly. He said it was something he would never forget. He said it felt like they finally got to do something for Catherine physically, that taking the cuffs that had bound her when she was murdered and putting them back on the man responsible was not a large gesture in the scope of a capital case, but it mattered deeply to the people who had worked the investigation. Those handcuffs had been a symbol of the crime for 26 years. Now they were a symbol of accountability. Foreman was booked into the Franklin County Jail in Ohio and charged with capital murder. Almost immediately, he began resisting the process. He fought extradition to Texas. When his extradition hearing was scheduled, he refused to leave his cell to attend it. A governor's warrant was prepared by the Jefferson County District Attorney's Office and forwarded to the governor of Ohio. After weeks of procedural delays, Foreman was eventually transported back to Jefferson County and formally indicted in September of 2021. The trial did not begin for nearly 3 more years. On March 11, 2024, jury selection commenced in the Criminal District Court of Jefferson County before Judge John Stevens. A panel of 12 jurors and 3 alternates was chosen from a pool of 100 residents. Nearly 30 years had passed since Catherine's murder. The evidence had survived. The witnesses had endured. But in the cruelest turn of the entire case, both of Catherine's parents, Mary and Lum Edwards, the couple who had driven to that townhouse on the morning of January 14, 1995, and found their daughter's body in the upstairs bathroom, had died in the years between the arrest and the trial. They never saw the inside of that courtroom. They never heard a jury speak the word guilty. The two people who had called the Beaumont Police Department every single year, who had refused to let the case disappear, who had carried the grief of that morning for the rest of their lives, were gone before the system finally delivered what they had spent decades asking for. Prosecutor Mike Laird told the jury during his opening statement that they would hear from family members who did not live long enough to testify or to witness this day. Bob Wortham, the Jefferson County District Attorney who had made the case a personal priority from his first day in office and who had pushed to reopen the investigation in 2020, had left the DA's position by the time Foreman went to trial. The case he championed outlasted his tenure. First Assistant District Attorney Pat Noth led the prosecution alongside Laird and fellow prosecutor Sonny Eckhart. Noth told the courtroom that he had waited 29 years to bring justice to Catherine's family. He said he wished her parents were alive to see it. No parent, he told the jury, should have to endure what Mary and Lum Edwards endured. What followed was 7 days of testimony, drawn from a witness list of 73 names. One of the first witnesses called was Allison Edwards Brocado, Catherine's identical twin. She was 60 years old now. Allison described the days leading up to her sister's death and told the jury that Catherine was trusting. Maybe too trusting. The courtroom was packed. Foreman sat calmly at the defense table through all of it, showing no visible reaction to anything that was said. The prosecution laid out the full arc of the case. The DNA evidence, the crime scene processing, the clothing Catherine had been wearing, the handcuffs, the sexual assault kit results. Expert witnesses from multiple laboratories walked the jury through the evolution of the forensic science, from the original 20-marker profile produced in 1995 to the 500,000 marker profile extracted by Othram in 2020. The recorded video of Foreman's interrogation in Ohio was played for the jury. Diana Coe took the stand and testified about the billy club, the handcuffs on the mirror, the briefcase in the trunk, and the phone call where her ex-husband responded to the news of Catherine's murder with nothing more than 2 hollow words. The defense called 0 witnesses. Clayton Foreman did not take the stand. His attorney, Tom Burbank, told the jury that after 29 years, evidence degrades and memories shift. He pointed to an unknown male DNA sample found beneath Catherine's fingernails and suggested that someone else may have been present that night. The prosecution's response was direct and devastating. Catherine's hands had been handcuffed behind her back from the time the assault began. She could not have scratched her attacker. There was no physical mechanism for his DNA to end up under her nails. The trace genetic material recovered from the fingernail clippings could have come from any person who had contact with those evidence samples over 3 decades of storage and handling. The defense's central argument collapsed under the weight of a single anatomical fact. On the final day, the prosecution called one last witness. The judge advised the jury that they were about to hear evidence of a separate crime committed by the defendant. And then Paula Ramsey took the stand. She was in her early 60s now. More than 40 years had passed since the night Clayton Foreman drove her to that empty field. She had carried the memory of what he did for most of her adult life, and she had watched from a distance as Catherine Edwards's case slowly wound its way through the system. When asked at trial why she had come forward, she said she wanted to see justice done for Catherine. Ramsey looked across the courtroom and identified Clayton Foreman without hesitation. After more than 4 decades, she still recognized the man who had driven her to that field. She testified through tears about the belt binding her wrists, the knife he pulled from the glove compartment, the empty field where he stopped the car, and the silence she kept for a week afterward because she felt ashamed and convinced herself that no one would believe her. She described the weight of carrying that secret and the slow realization, years later, that the system's failure to hold him accountable in '81 may have contributed to what happened to Catherine in '95. Her testimony was the last thing the jury heard before closing arguments. Prosecutor Knauth stood before the jury and reminded them of everything the evidence had shown. He asked them not to let Catherine down. He told them they were the voice that Catherine's family, her friends, her students, and the Beaumont community had waited 30 years to hear. Defense attorney Burbank told the jury that after nearly 3 decades, the prosecution had not met its burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. He acknowledged that the jury might not like his client because of the prior assault testimony, but insisted that disliking someone is not the same as convicting them of murder. The jury left the courtroom to deliberate. They had heard 7 days of testimony, dozens of witnesses, and a mountain of forensic evidence spanning 3 decades of scientific advancement. They returned in approximately 52 minutes. Guilty. Capital murder. Unanimous. Families seated in the gallery remained silent as the verdict was read. Clayton Foreman showed no visible emotion. Judge John Stevens sentenced him to life in prison. The prosecution had not pursued the death penalty. Foreman will be eligible for parole when he turns 93 years old, in the year 2061. He is currently incarcerated in a Texas Department of Criminal Justice facility, where he will almost certainly spend the remainder of his natural life. He filed an appeal challenging multiple aspects of his trial. In January of 2026, the Ninth Court of Appeals issued its ruling and upheld his conviction in full, rejecting every claim his defense had raised. That included challenges to the admission of the 1981 assault testimony, alleged violations of his Miranda rights during the Ohio interrogation, and accusations that hearsay evidence had been improperly allowed. The appellate court identified 12 specific similarities between the Ramsey assault and Catherine's murder, and determined that the trial court had been correct to allow the jury to hear that testimony. The conviction stands. The sentence stands. And unless a higher court intervenes, Clayton Foreman will remain behind bars for the duration of his natural life. Texas Ranger Brandon Bess, reflecting on the case after the conviction, said that investigators had always believed the killer was someone Catherine knew, but he said nobody expected it would turn out to be someone who had been in her wedding. That was the part nobody saw coming. A man who stood in the same photographs, attended the same ceremonies, walked through the same hallways of Forest Park High School, and returned decades later to organize memorial tributes to classmates who had died. He organized tributes to the dead. He composed remembrances. And the entire time, he knew what he had done. Catherine Edwards was 31 years old when she was killed. She taught 5th grade at Price Elementary. She had an identical twin sister who looked so much like her that they had to warn new students not to be confused. She had a beagle named Maggie, and a routine built around lesson plans, dog walks, and evenings with family. She lived a quiet, kind life in a city that never forgot her. Her parents called the police department every year for decades, asking if anything had changed. They died without seeing their daughter's killer held accountable. Her twin sister Allison sat in a courtroom nearly 30 years later and spoke to a jury about the person Catherine had been. Paula Ramsey, who had waited even longer, walked into that same courtroom and told a room full of strangers what Clayton Foreman did to her in 1981, so that Catherine's death would not go unanswered. And the handcuffs that were used to restrain Catherine on the night she was murdered are the same handcuffs that were used to arrest the man who killed her. Some cases close with paperwork. This one closed with justice delivered in the exact form the crime was committed, 26 years apart. The same steel, the same click. That is the story of Mary Catherine Edwards. If this case stayed with you, share it, leave a comment, tell someone about it. Catherine's name deserves to be spoken, and the people who fought for decades to solve this case deserve to be recognized. Subscribe to Watch Crime Cold File if you haven't already, and make sure notifications are turned on so you never miss a case. We tell these stories because the people at the center of them matter. Catherine mattered, and now you know why.